no high UNC official met any PDP official.
You don't need the UNC to pass the bill.
This is the worst and they need to go.
Fire burn you, Guardian.
How much more could we tolerate?
You lack the intellect and the competence.
Everywhere else is vaccinating except Trinidad and Tobago.
You cannot pay people money that you owe them.
Almighty God, Creator of the universe and embodiment of divine wisdom and light, we come before you with thanksgiving and praise. May your will be done in our nation as it is in the heavens. Please bless our political leader, party officials, activists, and all the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Give us the grace to always see good, be good, and do good, and the courage to serve the people. Protect us as we stand against injustice and iniquity, and inspire our endeavors to find the right solutions to the problems that are affecting our fellow citizens. Grant that we may always work together with humility and respect for the greater happiness of all and the honor and glory of our country. Amen.
Good night to our political leader, the Honorable Kamla Prasad Bisesa. And let me indicate and to extend greetings to all our listeners, viewers, to this very important engagement this evening that we are hosting in Port of Spain. This evening we are addressing the vexing and serious issue dealing with procurement. But before I get into procurement, may I extend to the loved ones who have lost their family and friends to this vicious, dangerous, and deadly COVID-19 virus. We understand from reports from the Ministry of Health there were some 248 positive cases today, and a few more deaths. My brothers and sisters, we are appealing to you from this platform to do everything to keep yourself and your family safe. We would like you to follow the protocols that have been outlined over and over again. Keep your distance, sanitize, and of course, wear your mask. So this evening we are here in Port of Spain addressing the matter of public procurement. Public procurement, brothers and sisters, is a very serious issue. It deals with the acquisition of goods, services, and other works by the government through the public sector and other agencies. In 2015, the United National Congress, as part of the People's Partnership, passed the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, known as Act Number 1 of 2015. Since then, the PNM has brought several amendments to weaken, to emasculate, subvert, and destroy this very important oversight mechanism to ensure that there is accountability, there is integrity, there is transparency, and of course, value for money, value for each dollar that is spent. My brothers and sisters, each year from 2015-2016, this government has spent an average of $35 billion on the acquisition of goods, services, and other works. Over a 5-year period, they have spent close to $170 billion without any accountability, no transparency, no value for money, no independent oversight mechanism to supervise their spending. The cabinet has weaponized legislation in order to legalize banditry, thievery, and naked grand corruption in our nation, resulting in citizens not being able to procure basic services, basic goods, whether it is medicine or pharmaceuticals at our hospitals, whether it has to do with devices, electronic devices for our children, whether it has to do with hospital beds and other facilities for our citizenry. The situation is the same, my brothers and sisters. The government is a runaway train, a runaway horse that we need to cage and put in a stable, literally, in order for us to control their voracious appetite to steal and to rob from the public purse. So this evening we have put together a very powerful team of speakers to address you on this matter of public procurement and why we in the UNC are calling for the repeal of all those offensive and obnoxious amendments to our public procurement law of 2015, where the PNM has legalized thievery and naked corruption, and the cabinet is overseeing itself in the purchase of goods, services, and other works, and they have frowned upon establishing an independent oversight mechanism, which is what is called the Office of Procurement Regulator. My brothers and sisters, before I introduce our first speaker to you tonight, I want to bring to your attention an element which emphasizes the need for procurement, the need for oversight. the need for supervision in terms of public spending, of public monies by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Brothers and sisters, just a couple of days ago, a judgment was handed down in the High Court involving what is called Clico Investment Bank and a group of persons associated with that bank, including one Andre Montai. Brothers and sisters, we learned, and the evidence is clear, that the role of the Attorney General of this country, who was then a director of the Clico Investment Bank, and who sat at the Clico Investment Committee, and who sat at the board of directors of the Clico Investment Bank in 2007 and approved $78 million to one Andre Montai, who was a former PNM treasurer, without any security. And today a judgment was handed down demanding and ordering this man to repay CIB $100 million, the $78 million that he borrowed, and $22 million in accumulated interest. Tonight we call on the Attorney General, this hypocrite, this lawmaker by day and lawbreaker by night, to tell the country, to tell the citizenry what role you played in this scandal, this fraud that was perpetrated, I should say, against the people of this country. So we are calling on you, Faris Alwari, in isolation, to come clean and tell the country what was your role. And as an Attorney General of this country, then Director of Clico Investment Bank, why did you preside over this scandal and this massive fraud that was perpetrated by those individuals in this judgment that was delivered on the 19th of April? This tells you, brothers and sisters, the manipulation that can take place by a few persons against the interests of the nation. Hence the reason there's need for public procurement. There's need for an independent oversight mechanism to ensure that this thief-free does not continue, my brothers and sisters. So we have a lot of questions for Faris Alwari this evening, but I do not want to detain you any longer. I want to introduce our first speaker, a young, dynamic businessman, entrepreneur. He is one of the dynamos in our Senate. Young, progressive, forward-looking individual. My brothers and sisters, I would like you, wherever you are, to put your hands together and warmly welcome Senator Damian Leida, our dynamic senator, who will address you on this vexing question of procurement and the weaponizing of it in legislation by the PNM to legalize thief-free, naked corruption. My brothers and sisters, I bring to you no other than Damian Leida, Senator Damian Leida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Wade Mark, for that very powerful opening. I'd like to recognize our honorable political leader, Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bisesa. I also say good evening to all of you who are listening on the airwaves, on social media, via Facebook, via YouTube, and so forth. I say to you, good night at a not so good time. You see, brothers and sisters, tonight I speak not only as a senator in the opposition, but as a loyal citizen defending the constitutional and democratic rights of every citizen of our great nation, Trinidad and Tobago. And it has now become, brothers and sisters, a painful task in the Senate, fighting week after week against a draconian government who continues to erode the tenets and principles of good governance by eliminating the act of transparency and accountability. Brothers and sisters, Trinidad is no longer the paradise that it once was, as it continues to slide down that slope of economic hardship that we are all as citizens experiencing right now. And brothers and sisters, to compound this problem, we are faced with a government that make laws which tramples on the constitutional rights and freedoms of citizens. And when you couple this with the policies of this government that puts the power in the hands of PNM politicians, friends, family, and financiers, brothers and sisters, you can't take God out of your thoughts. You see, brothers and sisters, as I have said on other platforms, we see this dreadful story continue to be played out in this disgraceful and shameful passing of legislation, namely the Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, passing it by a simple majority in the Parliament, with corruption, brothers and sisters, becoming more and more rampant in this wicked PNM government, and mismanagement of our resources becoming the order of the day. We see a government come to Parliament to pass legislation and its amendments that literally legalize corruption, as they completely gut, water down, and emasculate this legislation. Brothers and sisters, we must never forget, I think Senator Mark reminded us just now, we must never forget that it was the People's Partnership UNC government, led by the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa, that brought this legislation to Parliament during our tenure. It is our government that brought Act Number 1 of 2015, known as the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act. But brothers and sisters, what Senator Mark didn't tell you, and what I will remind you, is that you must never forget that it was a PNM opposition at the time that stalled, sabotaged, and delayed our government in our objectives in passing this act. Brothers and sisters, what Senator Mark did not remind you about as well, and which I will remind you, is that it is the same PNM government that boasted in their 2015 manifesto that they were going to bring this legislation to the Parliament. And it is the same PNM government that after 5 years, after 5 budgets, budget after budget statement, promising to operationalize this legislation and present the regulations. But brothers and sisters, what we see instead, rather than that, rather than bring the legislation to this country, instead they came to the Parliament with 3 amendments in 2016, 2017, and then in my time, having debated it in the Senate in 2020. And brothers and sisters, it will pain you to know that after that debate, and up until today, having railroaded that legislation through Parliament and passing it by a simple majority, they still have not presented the regulations to empower the law. So brothers and sisters, the government, in presenting Act Number 17 of 2020, they basically eliminated the independent oversight role of the Office of the Procurement Regulator. They have literally castrated the powers of the independent regulator by cutting Section 7 of Act Number 1 of 2015. Brothers and sisters, in Section 5 of Act Number 7 of 2020, this wicked and corrupt P&M government empowered the cabinet to now legalize blatant thievery of our public purse. The cabinet has now circumvented the independent procurement regulator, rendering him useless, and the government could now enter into procurement and disposal of public property without the oversight of this independent procurement regulator. Now, brothers and sisters, let me tell you what this means. They can now engage in planning, bidding, evaluating, and implementation involving millions, if not billions, of your taxpayers' dollars without having to report this to the independent regulator or having to show transparencies to the honest tax-paying citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. They can literally sit in their cabinet rooms and enter into major deals while keeping all the details of these deals veiled in secrecy. Brothers and sisters, let me take a moment to explain to you some of the areas that they gutted from the legislation, some of the areas that they've removed from the oversight of the procurement regulator. Let's start with the first one. All agreements with other states and foreign countries. So, brothers and sisters, when we see them going and making deals for boats down in Australia, and we hear about the alleged corruption in a HTC deal with a Chinese company, and we see those type of things happening, they have now removed that from the oversight of the procurement regulator and can now enter into these deals without the citizens knowing what's happening. Here's the next thing. All agreements with international financial institutions. All agreements with technical, legal, audit, and accounting services. All agreements for medical goods and services. And brothers and sisters, hear this one. This is the one that should put the fear of God in your minds tonight. Any other service as deemed by the cabinet and by extension the Minister of Finance. So, let me tell you what it is. At any given moment, this minister could wake up in the morning, and if there's any other business that could be to the benefit of the friends, family, and financiers, and one of them talk to a cabinet minister or the finance minister and say, hey, pull this from the procurement, they have the powers to do that. The cabinet also give itself the power to enter into public and private partnership agreements without the oversight of the independent regulator. Brothers and sisters, when we hear about cabinet ministers recusing themselves countless times, record times, you ask yourself the question, how many of them have interest in that list I now told you there tonight? How many of them, how many friends, family, and financiers of them have benefited from one of those areas I have just documented for you? Brothers and sisters, let's go a little bit further, because I don't want it to be that the UNC is the only one talking about this. Because, brothers and sisters, we have listened to the concerns coming out of the Office of the Regulator. Let me tell you, brothers and sisters, after extensive consultation, the Office of the Procurement Regulator upheld a public advisory number 15 on the 3rd of December 2021 regarding the amendment to the law. And I'm going to quote for you what they wrote. So I quote, stakeholders emphasize that Section 7 should be given an opportunity to be tested, since there is a real possibility that local supplier contractors may be deprived of a fair and equitable chance to participate in procurement proceedings. Any variation to this provision may undermine the objectives of the Act, namely accountability, integrity, transparency, and value for money. Brothers and sisters, that's not the UNC, you know. That is the Office of the Procurement Regulator. In other words, they were against the amendments because the notice by the regulator was signed by the chairman, Mr. Munilal Lalchan. Brothers and sisters, let's go a bit further. Put them aside. Maybe they're better. But let's go now to the Law Association, who also came out against the gutting of this Procurement Act. Brothers and sisters, in a strongly worded letter that was reported in the Express newspaper on December the 8th, 2020, the Law Association made clear their position against specific changes to the procurement law, where they stated, and I quote again, the removal of oversight, scrutiny, accountability, and administrative fairness in the procurement process in relation to the treaties and agreements referred to in Section 7.1 amounts to constitutional impropriety, degrading public trust and confidence. Brothers and sisters, are you hearing what the Law Association said? Constitutional impropriety, degrading public trust, degrading public confidence. This is not the UNC saying this. This is the law that the Rowley PNM have put in place, a flag-bearer law for the promotion and advancement of corruption in this nation. Brothers and sisters, the reason why your loyal opposition can come to you and expose many of the questionable deals by this government is because we had a system of checks and balances in place. We could come to you and challenge this government and show the nation why a deal is questionable. But now they have changed the law. They can conduct these deals in the still of the night, all in their cabinet rooms, or in some PNM official's house, or some friend, family, and financier house, knocking scotch glasses, and as my brother Anil will say, eating shrimps, closing deals, no oversight from the public procurement regulator. And only if someone come and drop that deal in our mailbox will we be able to expose them now. But brothers and sisters, not to worry, our mailbox is filling up. Brothers and sisters, you saw it for yourself that the deputy chairman of the procurement regulator resigned. It was a Mr. Chankit. You heard the statements of the private sector and civil society group who pulled together in 24 hours an emergency press conference that called for the government to hold their hand on passing this legislation in the parliament. And you heard the public noises of the Law Association. These organizations came out strongly against the amendments to the law as recent as December 2020. Brothers and sisters, let me come back to the deputy chairman, Mr. Chankit, when he cited, and I quote, final emasculation, the amendments to the public procurement law. He further went on to say, and I quote, the subsequent stalling and stymieing of our efforts to have the necessary regulations proclaimed as we went through the many challenges to our jurisdiction, interminable reviews, and subtle attacks brought on by the government via its agents in state enterprises, Minister of Finance and Attorney General, both subtle and frontal, underwrote its reluctance for proper oversight of its spending. Are you hearing this? You are hearing this from the now resigned deputy chairman. He couldn't stay there any longer. He could not sit down there and deal with that. The government was particularly stalling and toying with them. This PNM government never bought the regulations needed to put the procurement regulator to work. That's the bottom line. Only to come like a thief in broad daylight and change the law to sideline the regulator in these key matters. Brothers and sisters, this is a brutal attack on the tax-paying dollars of our country and a criminal attack on the citizens of our nation. Our grandparents, our parents, our children, and our grandchildren, all will be affected from this. And brothers and sisters, we cannot afford to see this potential level of corruption, especially when we see the dire state of our economy. Brothers and sisters, over the last 5 years, we've seen our economy declining by almost 18%. Our debt to GDP has rose astronomically to 82% and more. They are borrowing us into a hole that our great-grandchildren will have to dig out of. Our credit rating at BBB negative, according to Standard & Poor's, and Moody's literally declaring us as junk bond status. Brothers and sisters, when we see the ease of business in this country go from 62 in the world under the UNC government to now over 105 in the world. And we see it becoming more and more difficult to conduct business in this country. We can't allow this kind of legislation to pass. When foreign direct investment in the last 5 years has declined by almost $1 billion. And you wonder why we have to stand up in lines in banks to get a little kakada, a little $100, a little $200. You wonder why? Brothers and sisters, when we see our foreign reserve decline from $11.5 billion under the UNC to now $7 billion under this wicked PNM government, we could allow this kind of procurement to continue. Brothers and sisters, and this one is the one I want you to listen to now. When the Corruption Perception Index places our country at 86 in the world out of 180 countries, we see Trinidad and Tobago on the bottom 50% of all countries rated in Corruption Perception Index. Brothers and sisters, this tells us that corruption in this country under this wicked government is running rampant and roughshod in our nation. And brothers and sisters, we expect the Corruption Perception Index will now worsen as a result of this government gutting and emasculating this procurement legislation. Brothers and sisters, Senator Mark pointed it out. We see over $35 billion per year being spent by this Rowley government on goods and services. And now we see this legislation enacted by this government. Brothers and sisters, the fear of God should be in your mind tonight. Brothers and sisters, this government will continue borrowing their way deeper and deeper into debt, which your children and grandchildren have to pay. This government will continue raiding the Heritage and Stabilization Fund on these secretive deals while robbing the patronage of your children and grandchildren. This government will sell our country's assets, such as the refinery and WASA and anything else, to friends, family, and international bandits without the rightful owners of these assets having a say. The rightful owners, you, the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And finally, brothers and sisters, they will now freely and openly raid the treasury containing your tax-paying dollars on these corrupt deals that this legislation now empowers them to do while veiling it from public scrutiny. Brothers and sisters, this passing of this legislation is criminal. This is corrupt. This legislation has been condemned by the Law Association. This legislation has been condemned by the private sector and civil society organizations, including the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association, the various chambers of commerce, AmCham, and Transparency International. And this bill must now be condemned by every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. Every one of us in this country should get up and shout at the top of our voices in one unison and call this government to account and demand that they repeal this public procurement legislation. They must repeal it, and they must repeal it now. And I say in closing to the Prime Minister of this country, when you make a statement and say you don't want to hear nothing from the opposition about borders, remember I tell you, 50% of this country voted for the opposition. You can't cut out 50% of our country. You must listen to us. You must secure our borders, and you must repeal this procurement legislation. And I thank you.
My brothers and sisters, today is internationally recognized as International Labor Day, popularly known as May Day, where the working class celebrates their achievements and they reflect on the way forward. We in Trinidad and Tobago would like to we in the UNC would like to extend our solidarity, and we wish to salute the working class of our nation, who is under severe pressure by this oppressive regime led by Keith Christopher Rowley. So on the occasion of May Day, we wish to extend our solidarity with the working class, not only here in Trinidad and Tobago, but internationally, my brothers and sisters. My brothers and sisters, I want you to remember this case that was the judgment that was given on the 19th of April involving the Clico Investment Bank. There is a director on that bank that needs to account to the country. His name is Faris Alwari, the Attorney General. I want to share with you tonight, before I introduce the next speaker, that Faris Alwari was installed as a director of the Clico Investment Bank on the 16th of November 2006. He served in 2007, he served in 2008, and my brothers and sisters, he served in 2009. Let me just quote for you on page 10, paragraph 28 of that judgment that talked about a massive fraud involving the $78 million that was loaned to one Andre Montai. Hear what the judge said, brothers and sisters, and I quote, "Satisfied that Stone Street was able to service the loan of $78 million on or about the 13th of February 2007, Richard Trotman, the CEO, held a series of teleconferences to discuss the loan with all of the then directors of the CIB except Montai. Faris Alwari was one among the directors that Trotman spoke to. We want to ask Faris Alwari, did you agree to that $78 million? Did you object to that $78 million? Tell us, did you record any reservations? Hear what the judgment went on to say on that same page 10, paragraph 28. On February 14, 2007, Trotman prepared a note for the investment committee of the board of directors of the CIB. That board comprised of one Faris Alwari and another director, outlining the terms of the CIB offer to Stone Street and Montai's interests. On the same day, Clico Investment Bank disbursed the sum of $78 million by way of a check made out to Clico and signed by Trotman and one Mala Gandhi. Brothers and sisters, Faris Alwari, as a member of that investment committee, according to this report, did not object. Therefore, Faris Alwari, you must tell us, if you did not object, you agreed at the investment committee level. And then later on, you went on to the board of directors level and you agreed. Brothers and sisters, we need answers from the Attorney General on this matter. This is a very serious matter of fraud. And the Attorney General has to account to the country for this massive fraud that has taken place in that particular bank called the Clico Investment Bank. My brothers and sisters, I wish to now introduce our second speaker this evening. He is a young economist, a young dynamic soldier in the army of the United National Congress as we push forward for peace, justice, freedom, bread, and social progress for all of our people, regardless of race, religion, region, ethnicity, station, or status. He is a young economist. My brothers and sisters, it gives me great pleasure in bringing to you this evening to talk to you and to talk with you on this issue of this Public Procurement Act. No other person than Brother Tahaka Obika. Welcome, Tahaka Obika.
Good evening, and thank you, Senator Mark, Chairman and Leader of the Opposition Bench in the Senate. Good evening to our political leader, the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa, and all our UNC family, Trinidad and Tobago citizens, locked on and listening, whether you are locked out of the country or you are at home observing COVID-19 protocols. A pleasant good evening to you. Now I want to share with you the conclusion of an advisory by the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago on the public procurement amendments, the amendments that this government brought, culminating in amendments at the beginning of December. And this is their statement. In our view, the removal of oversight, scrutiny, accountability, and administrative fairness in the procurement process in relation to the treaties and agreements referred to in Section 7.1 amounts to constitutional impropriety, degrading public trust and confidence. Dated 8th day of December 2020, respectfully submitted by the Law Association. The actionable words in that conclusion: constitutional impropriety, degrading public trust and confidence. Now, that is by no means scant criticism. That is by no means criticism that any government would want to ignore. In fact, such criticism should not only raise alarm bells, but it should cause the government to jump into action to get to the bottom of the problem, to get to the root of the problem, to fix this problem that, in fact, not only the Law Association came out against in strong and very direct language, but also the chambers of commerce, the civil society groups. You heard Senator Leida articulate on that, Senator Mark as well. However, this government has allowed those cries to blow like the Sahara dust in the wind. They've ignored them completely. Now, if I were to go deeper into this public procurement issue, when you try to appreciate where the law association was coming from, there are certain aspects of the law where they were very clear. And there were some other aspects that if you take even a cursory look at the law, even from a layman's perspective, you would recognize that it is not in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago, these amendments brought by the government. Public procurement means government contracts. And a big issue when Keith Rowley was ostracized in the PNM back in 2008 had to do with the term that he made popular, bid rigging. And that term had to do with a one called a Hart, whose name and reputation was at the heart, pun intended, of significant corruption allegations leveled against the Patrick Manning administration. And Keith Rowley, then an ostracized opposition government MP, basically went into opposition to his government on the issue of bid rigging. However, but here we see in this law, the bid rigging under the Parent Act was the collusion between persons for the purpose of manipulating the proceedings, was changed in definition to collusive, price fixing, and anti-competitive behavior designed to unfairly influence the outcome of a competitive tender process in favor of one or more bidders. Now, anti-competitive behavior. That specific term doesn't hold, as we say in Trinidad, as much water as what was there in the Parent Act. So whilst it might seem a very trivial piece in the puzzle, because if we draw our minds back to this whole issue that surrounded a Keith Rowley, then ostracized by his own government before Kamala Persad became Prime Minister, on the issue of bid rigging, that change in definition seeks to water down this legislation in a very material way. Now, when we go further, we see regarding the powers of the state to remove from the purview of the Office of the Procurement Regulator arrangements such as a treaty or other form of agreement between Trinidad and Tobago with a state or a state within a state. So therefore, you have a Minister of Finance bearing in mind that in their 6 years, they would have crossed in excess of $300 billion in spending. Because from 2015 to 2020, they would have spent in excess of $253 billion. When you add this year's fiscal package, they would have crossed $300 billion in spending. Such spending, if left unchecked, results in significant value for money lost by the taxpayer. So that road that you need in the west of Trinidad, that community hospital you need in South Trinidad, that school you need in Tobago, those projects could easily go from being 10 million to 15 million. And the extra 5 million does not amount to any increase in value to you, the citizen. What it amounts to is a tax on the treasury. Corruption is a tax on the treasury. Now, why is this important? Because we have children today, to the 3,500 if you were to take the government's statistic, that do not have electronic devices, that cost an amount that is comparable to the rent received by a high-ranking government official. If this government were to appropriate funds with a priority being the people of Trinidad and Tobago, then maybe your children in your classrooms, in your households, would have the electronic devices that were promised to them by the government. If people were a priority, then of course you'd have a procurement legislation that ensures, as we say in Trinidad, all roads lead to the office of the procurement regulator. And therefore, you get value for money. The IMF sent out an advisory dated February 17th this year, where they are stating that they are promoting transparent and accountable use of COVID-19 financial assistance. This government came to the Parliament last year at the early stages of the pandemic and got approval for withdrawal of $1.5 billion from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund for the purposes of budgetary support because of the pandemic. That's $10 billion of your money. How have they accounted for that? How have they accounted for that, since many families, even today in this current lockdown, are going without income support? They have failed to do so. Then of course they will go and procure goods and services, medical services, significant in a pandemic, but these services have been removed from the scrutiny of the procurement regulator. In a pandemic, when you have taken $10 billion from our national savings, approval to take $10 billion, they have taken at least $7 billion already. So you've taken billions of dollars from our national savings in a pandemic where medical services is critical, but you've removed medical services from being under the scrutiny of a procurement regulator. Now, that has to be the biggest red flag where enabling corruption is concerned. And IMF is stating in this advisory in February 2021, COVID-19 is causing tragic loss of life and has disrupted economies and societies on a scale that we have not seen in living memory. And they're working closely with its members to meet their emergency need for financing, while sustaining the fight against corruption and the misuse of urgently needed resources. So the IMF is recognizing that you have countries and governments that are misappropriating funds meant for relief. So you ask yourself in your household, you got some relief before an election. Election come and gone. August finished, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. We enter May. 9 months have passed. You can make a child. Not a single household has been approached for the same income support that was necessary before the election. But you ain't going through a pandemic now? Or it's just because we're not going through an election now? They don't need your vote, so they don't care if you have to struggle, have to suffer to put food on your table. Now, whilst you might be in a position where you might be a salaried employee, your company may have the challenge of providing that income for you. No mention of any support to them. If you are not a salaried employee, you are self-employed. The lockdown measures, the restrictions, the closures affecting your business. Where is the income relief for you? But you don't matter to this government because there is no election on the horizon. Now, of course, many people would listen to that and they will benefit from this high intellectual speech. But many persons listening, the younger ones especially, may not appreciate this platform talk. So I want to bring it down in a language that we could all understand. Because before I was a political operator, I was a storyteller. So procurement. What is this whole thing the country talking about? Procurement. And what the talk had to do with the Trinidad and Tobago government? Because the procurement talk in fact means government contracts. So I went to university, UE, studied, get a degree, economics, finance. You understand, you could call it a master's. But instead of bringing this big speech, it's best I break it down to the lingo that we all know. Some good storytelling, like we used to do in Trinbago. So you have a fella, imagine, call him the finance minister. Have a big building in town owned by his family, somewhere by Picton. Now, it's making millions of dollars if it sell. But to make things go even more well, the same mister, call the minister, go in parliament, change the law so that when the property sell, the family business end up making more. But that is not procurement. Some people call it corruption. I don't know. But whatever you call it, procurement is not that. Now, whatever next fella, he is an attorney. Attorney, you could call him for general in this space, in this place. And the government looking for space to put public servants, but they can't see the empty buildings by Government Campus Plaza. And they go on to some nice buildings on 1 and 3, Alexandria. And they pay him some good money for the family. Not 5 million, 10, 15, but 23 million TT money. And to make it sweet, sweeter than honey, they throw in some more money. Maybe 30 million, you never know. Just to outfit the property of the Al-Rari family. Now, money don't change hands like pigeon peas in the market, you know. That had to go through a contract. Government had to sign document. The agreement does take place in a place called cabinet. But instead of going through the independent autonomous procurement regulator, they could change the law if they want. So certain contracts, we ain't saying that one, could go through the finance minister. Now you tell me, that right, partner? But just remember, procurement, I say talking facts mean government contracts, but this procurement is the way the P&M control rowley government. Like to run sweet TNT. They rather leave government-owned building empty, half empty, so they could fill up the property owned and operated by the Al-Rawi family. But when it comes to children, they need laptop, they need computer, they need internet. But P&M may find that worthy of procurement because that is for your children's future, but not them children, not no partner. So it have a simple solution. If your children need money, you need to pave a road in the country, just take the building that occupied by the Al-Rawi family and make it empty. And the country will get plenty, much more money. That way the government aim at to go and find no conglomerate to lend them no money, to buy no vaccine, because the treasury go full back up already. And if that money is not enough, go and look for the fella who had the building on Picton Street. Change back the law and make sure he pay all that tax break he get back in the treasury, so we could have money to take care of you and your neighbor pick me. But the latest one, to close down the town, it have a fella who brother making all kind of big financial deal in this country. The newspapers reveal that fella used to be the minister in charge of the national assurity. So what we could do is take away that kind of financial security and make sure we bring the office of the procurement regulator to the fore, so that any deal, whether it's from Maduro, whether it's boats from Australia, had to fall right in line and go through the proper, independent, autonomous office of the procurement regulator. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, my brother Tahaka Obika. My brothers and sisters, I would like to rush on to our next speaker. But before I do so, let me just again go back to that judgment on April the 19th on page 23, paragraph 73. And I quote from that judgment. Hear what the judge had to say. And I quote, that the board of the Clico Investment Bank was ultimately responsible for all lending decisions. The supreme authority for all loans granted by the Clico Investment Bank rests with the board of directors. My brothers and sisters, the board of directors took a decision to approve $78 million for a gentleman called Andre Montai. Mr. Faris Alwari was then a director on that board. He sat on that board, he sat on the investment committee, and they agreed. The judge has described this development as a massive fraud. Is the Attorney General part of a massive fraud as outlined by the judge in that very historic and landmark judgment on April the 19th? AG, Attorney General, come out from your isolation and talk to the population about this development. You need to clear the air on this matter. My brothers and sisters, the next speaker to address you on this very important issue of repealing the public procurement law is a former president of the Senate, my colleague when I myself occupied office at that level as well. He acted as president of this republic on several occasions. He is a prominent and distinguished lawyer in our country and particularly in the city of Port of Spain. I would like to warmly welcome our next speaker, the Honorable Timothy Hamill Smith, who will address you on this very important subject matter.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Senator Wade Mark, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to be here with you. And one of the things you might ask yourself tonight is why, when so much rampant crime is occurring, when the economy is in the doldrums, why tonight are we talking about repealing the procurement legislation? So I want to demonstrate to you the importance of procurement legislation. And if in fact what we have, as we have developed, as part of the foundations of the home of Trinidad and Tobago, we've developed and built our country on the quicksand of corruption. Back in 1956, when the PNM launched, their motto was morality in public affairs. So they launched with this, and yet by the mid-60s, they were rocked by a number of scandals. So you had the lock joint scandal. You had the gas station racket. You had the horse racing complex scandal. And then you had the DC-9 affair. And such was those scandals that Selwyn Ryan, in his book, Eric Williams, The Myth and the Man, concluded that the motto of the PNM had been relegated to sleaze and immorality in public affairs, such that the shame and disgrace brought to the PNM by names like O'Halloran and Pravat and others ultimately led to a PNM consensus, all a wee thief. But the PNM were not content with that. The PNM then moved with all the usual smoke and mirrors and told you, we want to improve the public service. We want to make sure that you get services properly, in good order. And so they introduced the state enterprise system. But when you look back, you will know that service did not improve, and neither has the cost of such service improved. Instead, what all that happened was the state enterprise system bypassed the tenders board and the scrutiny of the civil service, which at least up to that time provided some cover. And so that you will recall the Udicot issue, Udicot a state enterprise, and the corruption associated with that. And that evolved in, you had the UF Commission. It looked into the construction industry. It looked into matters dealing with Calder Heart. And what they did, one of the very essence that the UF Commission made a recommendation was that we need to introduce into Trinidad and Tobago proper procurement legislation. So today why crime is spiraling out of control. There are frightening reports of guns and ammunition capable of being used in wartime. Debt is mounting. The economy is in a deathly spiral. You recognize that what had happened is at the very foundation. That's where the start of it is. The root cause of where we are today starts with corruption, starts with what had happened on the quicksands of PNM corruption at the very start of our independence in Trinidad and Tobago. So, in 2010, when the PP government entered into government, one of the things they sought to do was to reset the culture of corruption in public affairs. And how did they do that? They introduced procurement legislation. They consulted widely with the public sector, with the construction industry, and they shaped that legislation to make sure that it was secure. But when it went to the Joint Select Committee in Parliament, what you will see occurred, the leader of the opposition, he danced his way out of the Joint Select Committee. Luckily, we were able, despite those shenanigans, to have that Joint Select Committee make its recommendation to Parliament. And ultimately, it was passed in the Senate with all the independents and all the opposition senators voting in favor of the legislation. However, down in the House, the PNM members abstained. So you will see, if you trace the history of the PNM's actions as Terence Farrell would say, there's some allergy that the PNM has to anything independent. So they did not like an independent regulator. And the passing of that legislation was a truly historic moment in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. It gave the opportunity for us now to rechart our course, to point our compass in a different direction, and so that all citizens would have the opportunity, regardless of color, race, creed, party affiliation, to succeed, to participate, as our Constitution entitles them to do, into the affairs of Trinidad and Tobago. But that was not to be as yet. Lo and behold, when the PNM came into power in 2015, one of the very first acts they took was to seek to amend that legislation in order to appoint a tribunal with the power to remove the regulator. Can you imagine the regulator appointed by the president in his own absolute authority? The PNM was seeking to get around that and remove it. Had a potential through a tribunal. They didn't get away with it that time, but they kept on. Later on, they amended the act in order to reduce the term of office of members of the regulatory office. You wonder, what was the motive in doing that? And you're just left to wonder. But all of these things, when you connect the dots, tell a story. And that story ultimately led to 2020. 2020, in broad daylight, the essence of the public procurement legislation was gutted and the backbone of it removed. In broad daylight. Infamously, the government removed government-to-government contracts. That's what the PNM government did. They removed it from the purview of the regulator. Unbelievably, that meant that the state was entitled to spend billions of our dollars in contracts when it didn't with other governments, when it did not have to adhere to integrity, accountability, transparency. It didn't have to care about value for money. It didn't have to regard for efficiency or fairness, not for equity, public confidence, or sustainable development. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what the PNM government, if that bill, that act now becomes proclaimed, what they can do? What will they do? More than that, you ask yourself the question, when a tragedy of such immense proportions occurs in broad daylight, the question is, and this is despite the fact that the business sector, the civil society groups all complained vociferously about the attempt of the government to do this. So you ask yourself, what do you call this? Is this patriotism or is this treachery? You tell me. But beyond that, 6 years this government has been in power. 6 years. And they have yet to do anything of substance to implement the procurement legislation. They have left it in the back burner, almost uncared for. What in the meantime happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that if that legislation which has been gutted, the backbone of which has been removed, is allowed to remain in place and be proclaimed, then we are doomed. We are doomed to a life of rampant corruption. We are doomed to a life of violent crime and the end of hope for Trinidad and Tobago. If you want to look at it in the context of your day-to-day life, you know that the government has set up video cameras all over the country so that they can capture you on video if you commit a traffic offense. But can you imagine? The government can spend billions of our dollars, but they turn off the camera of the procurement regulator. He must not be allowed to see. There must be no transparency. There must be no accountability for the actions of the government. That is the essence of what has been done here. As a result, citizens, I urge you to join with us in the petition to the government to repeal this dastardly piece of amendment of this legislation. And if the PNM do not heed your cries, then I urge the next government not only to grant a solemn promise in their manifesto that they will repeal that legislation, and do more than that, that they will instill in that legislation no future government should be allowed to remove essential provisions of an act which has foundational impact on Trinidad and Tobago without a 3/5 majority. And so tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, do not remain silent. Our country and our country's life is at stake. Your children and your grandchildren will either prosper, or if we go down the PNM road, we go into despair, the economy becoming derailed, and rampant crime running right through the country. The choice is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, my honorable friend and colleague, who I still refer to as the Honorable President of the Senate, Timothy Hamill Smith, on his excellent presentation this evening here in Port of Spain, as those are the excellent pieces that came before his. My brothers and sisters, let us press on to our next speaker, a young lady, a young professional who has come forward this evening to share her perspective. She's an economist, she's a consultant, she's a professional, she's a patriot, she loves her country, She wants a country to press on, to move on, where we can have good governance for all of our society, regardless of your position or station. It is my distinct honor and pleasure in inviting our next speaker, young, dynamic sister, Charlene Maharaj, who will share with you this evening her perspective on this whole debate on the repeal of the procurement legislation. Let us warmly welcome our sister, Charlene Maharaj.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, salam alaikum to everyone. Thank you very much, Senator Mark. But my role this evening is slightly different. I'm really not going to share my views on the procurement legislation. When you asked me to speak this evening, what I did was to solicit the views of the average public, the average person out there. So, we surveyed a very, very small sample, 24 persons, to just get a temperature check on where people were at with respect to the procurement legislation. What are their views? What are their opinions? Are they even connected to this thing we are calling the procurement legislation? And that is what I'll be sharing this evening, because I believe we live in a representative democracy. But if we don't know the views of the public, how do we represent that? So that is what I'll be sharing. Archie? The title, if you could just go back, go back to the first slide, Archie. And that's specifically why I put the title, We, the People, and the Procurement Legislation. The perceptions and feelings of the sample public towards procurement legislation and our prevailing level of governance. Archie, right. The first thing we did was to ask everyone, what comes to mind when you hear the word procurement legislation? What it is people associate with this concept? The most frequently mentioned unaided responses were transparency, it deals with corruption, it's about reducing waste, and it's about government contracts. But very importantly, it is about government and state companies purchasing items, buying stuff. It's really about, but the most frequently mentioned was transparency. Archie. What is the intention behind the legislation? In order to garner that, we went into the preamble. We pulled out words such as good governance, accountability, transparency, value for money, and integrity. So if we were to line up people's perception of the procurement legislation and what is in the preamble, guess what? We get it. The public understands, just simply based on this small sample, and this again, I urge everyone, this is a temperature check. The public gets the purpose behind the procurement legislation. But in terms of these governance attributes, how did TNT fare? there were certain attributes. We spoke about transparency, we spoke about accountability. How did Trinidad and Tobago, in the perception of our people, fare? All right. Using a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is very poor and 10 is excellent, the maximum point that you can get, we ask persons, is there transparency in decision making by governments and state enterprises? Is our society getting value for money? Are our governments being held accountable? Is there fairness in the distribution of resources and the way that the laws are applied? And if you look at that graph, you'll see on every count, Trinidad and Tobago fell below the halfway mark. We did not even attain a midpoint of 5. So the conclusion from those questions are TNT suffers from a huge perceptual governance gap. And that is the space within which we must look at the procurement legislation. So why these gaps? Why people gave such low ratings? What were the factors driving that? Well, and I'll use very consumer language here. The price quoted projects always inflated, from ribbon cutting to construction, and they're always cutting some ribbon. Look at sandals. How much information was kept off the table? Only when more and more information started to come out, the government backed down. We do not know what is going on with our taxes. We take away people's homes and lands that they inherited for a big new airport. Where are the numbers to justify this? It's only at election time attention is paid to the poor and the rural areas. Or if they want to distract from something. No government is really transparent, Archie. So, next question, is there then a need for greater transparency and accountability? A significant majority wanted and said yes. And that included transparency, not only governments, but state-owned enterprises, state authorities, including the THA. So the key takeaway from this early part is that TNT suffers from a governance gap. And in very broad terms, we, the public, get that the role of the procurement legislation is to help bridge that gap. So where are we in terms of our understanding and awareness of the procurement legislation? What does our democratic space look like? The space within which this legislation is supposed to be delivered and the space within it's supposed to operate. So the question we ask, are you aware of the procurement legislation as a national topic of discussion in Trinidad and Tobago? The majority said yes, and the reason for that is because it was in the media, it was in the editorials, and was posted on social media. Only 1 out of the 24 persons had no knowledge of the procurement legislation, or whether it was discussed or even passed through Parliament. But here's where the tangent started going off. What is the status of the legislation? The majority of persons were not aware. 75% of the people that we spoke to from South, East, West, North, and Tobago were not sure 25% said it was just passed in Parliament. And what were the reasons for this? Because the procurement legislation is no longer trending. The courts were. We're not really hearing about it. No one really discussing or sharing it. It is no longer in the media. Do you know, so we proceeded, we delved a little further in the question. Do you know that the procurement legislation is also about the disposal of land and other government or publicly owned assets? The majority of our people that we sampled did not know that. They said it was about buying, it was about government contracts. It was not, they were not aware it was about the disposal of public property. Archie. Did you know that several services that government regularly contracts is being exempted or removed from the purview of the legislation? Again, the majority did not know. The few who are aware, that's in the green 25% corner up there, well, who are aware of the amendments, thought that these exemptions would turn the legislation and the regulator into a toothless bulldog. Those are exact quotes, by the way. But we had this high level of awareness and now this very low level of interest. What are the explanations? Why? Why? One, it fell off the media, mainstream media in large part. But things were not explained in practical terms. People did not connect with the explanations. They're seeing lawyers and politicians talking about it. Others, we do not have time to get involved. The majority of us are just trying to manage day to day. We may be simply fed up. But even those who were aware of the changes to the amendments felt that they did not have a real voice to effect change. The main thing, people felt unplugged, removed, alienated, and distant. People felt unplugged. So we delve further. So how close are you in your day-to-day lives to this procurement legislation? Does it affect you directly? 100% of the people said no, it does not affect them directly. This is about the government. This is about public property. This is not about my property. Yes, it can affect us indirectly in terms of value for money and so forth, but there's no direct impact on our lives, and therefore people are not tuning in. Archie. At that point in the discussion, because there were focus group discussions, we presented two scenarios. First scenario. So, the procurement legislation is about the disposal of public property. What if private property became public property? And let's take a look at it. Non-payment of fees and taxes, for example, with the property tax. Government seizes property. It now comes under disposal of assets, or disposal of property. And with the new legislation, that property can now be exempted for certain services. Take, for instance, a private hospital. It falls under medical services, which is exempted. Second thing, how can private property become public property? Compulsory acquisition, as in the case of the airport in Tobago. Archie. Second scenario. What about jobs and the procurement of services and the disposal of property under this legislation? The likelihood of public-private partnership, the privatization of SOEs, WASA, the Port of Spain. These are likely scenarios that have been bandied about in the press. Does the closure and potential sale of Petrotron and the loss of direct income on these families serve as an example? At that point, one person in one of the groups actually came out and said, you know, in these public-private partnerships, people speak about, the government speak about local content. But he said that doesn't necessarily mean that the locals are getting the best jobs either. In fact, he said it's normally the cog in the wheel jobs that locals would get. So yes, we are impacted. Our jobs are impacted. So given these two scenarios, it was like a eureka moment. You know what was the response? That I got, why nobody break it down like this for us? Why no one is explaining it and bringing it in our space, the things that matter to us, our property, our lives? And when that got going, people started to talk about the Pitch Lake, Chinatown, and why is Carl continuing with the MAX 8 aircraft? So there was interest that was generated after. Archie. So once those scenarios presented, I asked, so what now is your interest in the procurement legislation and the removal of certain contracted government services from the legislation? The majority of the people said they had a high level of interest and expressed a measure of concern concerning the removal of those services. These are my concluding statement, and it speaks to we the people, whether it's the little people, the big people, our democracy, our say, your responsibility. And I'll speak to who is your. Go ahead, Archie. The procurement legislation, transparent and accountable government, is being delivered in a very narrow democratic space. Go ahead. So my concluding remarks, given that the space that is going to be delivered in and operate, my shout out, this is my personal statement, not other people's views now, to the president, to the government, to the opposition. Let us pause and reset, plug the people back into our democracy, ensure that the procurement legislation adheres to the preamble that people spoke about at the beginning of our presentation, address the worrying governance ratings. Archie? And to the press. No. And to the press, let me just say, the same passion and the same lengths you went to with the Freedom of Information Act, the people need that support in delivering their voice in what is a representative democratic space. We need that support. Do not abort these efforts, because this is more than the procurement legislation. This is about our democracy. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Sister Charlene Maharaj, for your presentation here this evening on giving an objective survey that was conducted on this particular matter that we are addressing this evening. Thank you so very much. Let me rush on now and invite our penultimate speaker. He is a financial consultant. He's a very successful entrepreneur. He has been providing yeoman service to our country in better understanding financial matters. I would like this evening to invite our friend to address you on this very important subject this evening of procurement and the need to have this piece of legislation not only properly proclaimed, but all those amendments that were made by the PNM between 2016 and 2020 December repealed and have the Parent Act number 1 of 2015 fully proclaimed. It is my distinct honor to invite my colleague and friend, Vade Seram.
Thank you, Senator Mark, for your kind introduction. My reference to the distinguished speakers who are also on the panel and members of the viewing public. Good evening. The procurement and disposal of public property legislation and the impact of the amendments regarding the management of the public purse and public assets is causing major concerns in the country, given the fact that the amendments are taking us back over 50 years. And in fact, if we accept the amendments, then we could be looking at sending Trinidad and Tobago back to the Stone Age. The democratic system itself we have is under threat by the amendments. And if the amendments are allowed, then the discretion to buy or sell public property will reside in the hands of one person, the Prime Minister, thereby creating a monarchy via a democratic process. No doubt the Act in its original form was a major step in the right direction, where all arms of government and state enterprises would have been subject to a uniform code and rules with regard to the procurement and disposal of public property. In addition, the regulator would have had the responsibilities to ensure that best practices were employed and that they had the authority to regulate the process and apply penalties where due. The regulators also have the gargantuan task of training the vast number of civil servants and state enterprise employees engaged in the procurement and disposal process, including management and directors. The government, in its wisdom or lack thereof, introduced many exemptions that rendered the Act impotent. The disaster of such amendments has been well articulated by the opposition, civil society, the Law Association, and Chambers of Commerce. The President is yet to proclaim the legislation into law, and hopefully the President will abstain from doing so due to the totally unacceptable form the bill has taken. If the President is to act in the best interest of the country, she would simply refuse to proclaim the amendments and recommend the Act stay in its original form. The President must exercise discretion to spare the country from a very bad piece of legislation. Failing her rejection of the amendments, it would not be unreasonable to question the purpose of the position of the President in our country today. Many argue that the President must abide by the dictates of the government. I question that premise. The amendments effectively created two sets of regulators, one being the regulator itself and the second being the Minister of Finance, a recipe for disaster. The exemptions created by the amendments include government-to-government contracts, public-private partnership, finance and banking, accounting, legal, medical. And the last one, such other services that the Minister of Finance may determine. That's a very open privilege given to the Minister of Finance. Let me address the first three, and the comments I make regarding the first three also apply to the last four, which is accounting, legal, medical, and other services. With regards to government contracts, this was not defined in the Act. What exactly does government-to-government contract mean? Does a call to the Prime Minister of Australia expressing our desire to acquire certain boats, does that comprise a contract? So it's a major flaw in the amendments if government-to-government contracts are not defined. Regarding the procurement of the vessels from Australia, what role did the government of Australia play? Did they build the vessels? Was the financing made by the Australian government or through one of its agencies? Would that be interpreted as a government-to-government contract if the Exim Bank of Australia financed the purchase? Was the Australian government party to any of the agreements, or was the Australian government acting as a broker putting the deal together? All these things were unknown. Regardless of the definition of government-to-government contract, the fact remains that such contracts are not devoid of mistakes nor devoid of corruption, and therefore require a third-party review for the purposes of checks and balances. Was there any precaution done by our government regarding the value for money on the vessels? How was this process conducted? Was there any evaluation on the cost of financing, or was it lost in a comprehensive package? Were alternate supplies for vessels considered? How did government arrive at the decision for the vessel procurement from Australia? So there are several questions to be asked with regards to government contract. The bottom line is no contracts beyond a certain value should be exempt from the purview of the regulator. Let's look at public-private partnership. The Act did define what a public-private partnership involves. It's really the coming together of the private sector and the government to get a transaction done. The private company actually takes the risk of the assets, and these include several types of transactions, such as bolt, and we are familiar with what transpired in Tobago. So under a bolt contract, that would be exempt according to the amendments. It is, however, a blanket. Once this amendment is approved and brought into law, this means to say it gives the government a formula for creating all contracts as a public-private enterprise. For example, we can sell Petrotrin and retain one share, and that would be defined as a public-private partnership. As we did with the liquid to gas project, we retained the preference shares, and that would be defined as a public-private partnership. So therefore, it's a very loose arrangement that gives the government unfettered privileges of entering into any contract and twisting it to include a minority share or a minimal share, and it comes under the definition of a private-public partnership. And therefore, that would escape the purview of the regulator. Regarding the THA Bolt agreement, it's a very curious agreement that was taken to court, and unfortunately I don't think the court had the necessary competence to rule on it. But who would have vetted the cost to the taxpayers of such a Bolt arrangement? That is the cost of building separately from the cost of financing. What is the difference if the THA had borrowed funds and actually built the building? It's the same, except perhaps the Bolt was much more expensive. So therefore, by structuring a very expensive arrangement, you evade the purview, the review of the regulators. So the Petrotrin refinery, we could have sold that to any party and retained a very minority share, and that becomes a public-private arrangement. So we have to be very careful about how we accept that amendment, for the simple reason it gives government unfettered privileges in terms of disposing as well as procuring assets, public assets. With regards to financing and banking, which is my area of expertise, this is an area where the treasury of the central government and the treasury of large state enterprises have been pillaged for decades. The Ministry of Finance do not have the knowledge, nor the experience, nor do the state enterprises, and this is supported by evidence. Examples are too numerous to mention, and these include government interest rate swap transaction, where the government lost $75 million on a 10-minute call. Government yen swap transaction, where the details still cannot be explained, and they may have lost over $1 billion on that transaction. The Trintomar Petrotrin expensive sinking fund loan, which cost ultimately the government and the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago a 35% cost of financing, when interest rates at the time were below 5%. There was a WASA bond issue financing, where the bank earned over $300 million on a $1 billion bond financing. Conspiracy between banks and airlines to deceive investors by recording artificial profits via loans as a sale and leaseback arrangement. All these fancy transactions that are being promoted by the investment banks, international investment banks, and evade proper evaluation. And therefore, at the end of the day, the taxpayers really get the short end of the stick. I don't know if you recall where the Attorney General said that the international banks did not like including financing under the procurement legislation. And there are good reasons for that. The international banks do not want a third-party review of any of the transactions they are negotiating with the central government. If I were the AG, the very fact that the international banks say they want to be excluded from the regulators, that is good enough reason to include financing under the regulations. So therefore, finance and banking must not be excluded from the purview of the regulators. That would be a grave injustice to the country and taxpayers. The regulator is expected to provide control on proper evaluation of financial bids. A major problem is the elementary methods applied to evaluating financial bids, and this is a major problem. Hopefully, the regulator will develop expertise so that it can give uniform direction with regards to financing. A system of weighting that is used by the government and state enterprises at the present time is inappropriate. Other issues that I have identified: when should the regulator get involved? This is very, very crucial. Is it that the government and cabinet agrees to buy something and the regulator only gets involved when bids are received? Or do they get involved at a very early game to find out whether such an asset should be bought in the first place? In other words, what is the benefit of the acquisition of those assets to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago? Somebody has to get involved at that stage, because a decision to purchase, we have found numerous examples where either money is wasted or the decisions are very bad. For example, again, a very glowing example is the gas to liquid project. At what time would the regulator get involved? When I looked at the regulations, that particular issue was not clear, and it has to be clarified by Parliament. Who will determine what is to be bought and what is to be sold? Who determines the cost-benefit analysis? What does the feasibility study say? Who prepares the justification paper? What role Parliament plays in the decision to invest or to sell? In the case of sale of Petrotrain, at what stage would the regulator have gotten involved? Where was the justification and feasibility study on the Sandals project in Tobago? It was just announced by Cabinet that they're going to engage by building a hotel for Sandals based on some model that they have with regards to. Those models are not working. We are losing money. What role should Parliament play with regards to all these acquisitions and sale of assets? I think if we do not engage Parliament to debate these issues, then we are failing ourselves with regards to a proper working of democracy. Can government do what they want under our system? The Sedition Act is being challenged as unconstitutional. Can this procurement legislation also be challenged on the grounds of unconstitutionality? Attorneys via the court must get a ruling on whether an act requiring a special majority can be amended by a simple majority. Simple logic tells me that any amendment would also require the special majority to approve the amendments. So I think that is the first step to find out what is the legal position with regards to these amendments. The main purpose of government is to establish policies and laws that would be in the service of transparency and equity and in service of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, not for the benefit of a few. The government also has a fiduciary duty to the citizens. The government has this duty whether they recognize it or not. Fiduciary duty means a duty to act in the best interest of the party you represent. These duties require government to establish proper policies and laws to minimize corruption. So hopefully whatever decisions government is making, it is incumbent upon the opposition to ask, what policies do you have in place to give guidance with regards to a decision making concerning the acquisition of assets and the sale of assets? The government is required to establish independent institutions that would ensure proper checks and balance regarding the public purse. If the laws are inadequate and the government insists on not correcting them, the government may be in breach of their fiduciary duties towards the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The traditional view is that governments do not owe the citizens a fiduciary duty. However, in 1984 in Canada, there was a tilt where it was ruled that fiduciary duties do in fact exist. We need to explore this a lot further for the simple reason government is managing the assets and funds on behalf of the citizens and they cannot do what they want with it. This is an area to explore as well as the constitutionality of the amendment. On a last note, we are to consider the role of Parliament in decision making. The opposition must not be excluded from any decision making. Good governance and good democratic practices require widespread participation to include the opposition and civil society. We need not reinvent the wheel, but look at best practices around the world and adopt them to suit our circumstances. Senator Obika did mention in one of his presentations that in Ghana all government contracts with foreign companies must be debated and passed in Parliament. This is a practice we must adopt immediately. In such a process, where is there room for secrecy and confidentiality? Confidentiality is the first sign of smoke that may be hiding a raging fire of corruption and incompetence. I would suggest that the amendments be rejected outright and that the original act be strengthened in the very near future to regulate global best practices. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ved. Siram, thank you for your excellent presentation as we rush to our final speaker this evening on this very important matter of public procurement. None other than our colleague who is the Secretary of the Fishermen and Friends of the Sea, a humanitarian, a businessman, a social activist, a person who has been fighting for the rights of the citizens of this country, fighting for good governance in our nation, a fearless patriot. I have the distinct honor in inviting our final speaker for this evening on this very important subject of public procurement, no other person than my brother Gary Aboud.
Thank you, Wade. Members of the party, Auntie Kamala, all the previous speakers. Today, we feel honored to be here. And having listened to all of the speakers, many of the presentations carry a lot of the components of what we wanted to say today. But today our presentation, I have 4 pages of notes, 5 pages of notes, but the actual presentation is at the end, and it's only 10% of everything that I'm about to deliver. 90% of what I want to say is really an introduction. And when I heard, well, Senator Leiter and Obika were inspiring Senator Leiter because of his forcefulness and the actual clarity of how he delivered each of the points. They were crisp and clear. Senator Obika brought a certain humanity to the points and made it in a way that hit my heart, because it translated the technical, intellectual in a way to a simple way that was digestible. Timothy, as usual, spoke very clearly and has been speaking out on this issue for quite a long time. Charlene drove me home because, well, there is hope at the end after it's explained, but the fact that still most people in our country think that this legislation has no impact on their lives, that is tragic and quite a blow. So today, our little presentation was prepared by Alex, Christopher, and Lisa, who's the program director of FFOS, and I had less to do in the actual preparation and more in the rehearsal of the delivery. But I want to add my flavor that I'm calling on the religious leaders, the imams, the pundits, the priests and spiritual leaders, the archbishop, on business organizations, the chambers of commerce, DOMA, on the think tanks of the UE and the UTT, on all of the professors and those who have doctorates, the legal fraternity, eminent retirees, civil society members and leaders, humanitarians, political aspirants. I'm calling on you today more than ever, because this law requires translation. A lot of people don't understand the intricacies of what it means buying and selling of goods. They don't understand this transactional behavior, and they think government is more an administrative function. They don't realize, when we speak about, Senator Beaker, about 300 billion, the human mind really can't visualize even 1 million. The average person may never have seen 100,000. So the physical mass of $1 million, let's say in 20s or 5s, you can't carry it, it's too heavy. 10 million can't fit in a room. So when you talk about 1 billion, that's 1,000 million. And now we're talking about 300 and 400 billion. That's thousands and tens of thousands of millions. So this idea of governance is misunderstood. The idea of parliament and how it functions, and the role of the opposition and the role of the leading party, and the whole process by which laws are passed, and then the importance of how the laws are enforced. These are abstract. But every leader on every board of every private company who pays in excess of $1 million in tax per year, they know what I'm talking about. And my brother gave a presentation which really was an attack on the corporate sector, on the individuals who are successful, the lawyers and doctors and engineers. And that's why he blamed them, the successful, the so-called 1%. He blamed them for the failure of society because they are privileged. And there's a duty that comes with that privilege. And bypassing that duty and leaving it for Auntie Kamala and Uncle Wade, that it can't work like that. So we're failing. And until and unless you, the professors, and you, the doctors at the university, and the doctors of law, and the doctors of medicine, the double-digit earners who are paying in excess of $1 million in tax a year because you're earning more than 3, and your boards of directors are equipped with the best leaders, the best minds, but you are silent. you adopting the role of the common man, that this have no impact on your lives. You cushy and you think that you're good. But you're not. The society is crumbling. And if your social conscience is that you're going to go to some little high-rise or penthouse with your millions and be comfortable, then you need a wake-up call. And I hope you really don't get it, because it might come in a way that you didn't expect. So my presentation is 90% introduction. And I know my program director would say I'm swerving off of my role. And my presentation is all these documents. But I think it's important that the civil society perspective translates the presentations of the earlier speakers into something that you can digest, that you can understand, that you can take home. And that is that you are not immune to the impact of treating the speakers tonight like a circus show, like an entertainment charade, that we are all here. Wade is out here, 9 o'clock at night, absent from his family, to entertain you, that you could think about it and talk about it tomorrow, and by Tuesday you forget it. We need more of a critical connection to what is happening here. I told my program director that I wanted to say, and I promised I wouldn't say because they would charge me, that I thought that the whole nation would have gone into a riot when they amended the law. I thought Port of Spain would have been in trouble. Every person in every corner of the country would come out and march and demonstrate. I really thought so. She said, no, don't say that. They'll say, charge me for sedition. Well, quite frankly, I don't care. If they want to charge me for sedition, for my thoughts, I'm not inciting the public, but I expect that the public would stand up. But what has happened is the public have not stood up. But worse than that, all of the educated people. We are discharging them from our universities, spending billions of dollars to educate them. But they're not interested in public interest. They think they're going to all end up in a skyscraper on a penthouse paying $1 million in tax a year, and they don't have to worry about those on the ground who are suffering the shortage of goods and services. It's an illusion. It has to stop. And I don't mean to offend Uncle Keith or anybody, but what we have happening here is a terrible disintegration of our democracy, where we are becoming it's not a creeping dictatorship anymore, it's a galloping dictatorship, because if the public have no oversight, if they come and they charge us tax, they're charging a poor man at minimum wage, he have to pay NIS. And they're taking the money and they're spending it, and they're telling him, you can't control how we spending it. We spending it how we want to spend it. And against a background of a history of corruption that is mind-boggling. I mean, they talk about Pravat and O'Halloran. Most of the young people today, most of them don't even know who is O'Halloran. They don't know about the gas station racket and about the number of boats that were bought. By the time they landed here, they broke down. They could only sell them for scrap iron. Buying boats is the oldest scandal. The bigger the expenditure, the bigger the corruption. So, no one knows that the Pitch Lake has been sold. 99-year lease. I mean, I would put it in my notes that it was sold for $50 million US. But why wasn't a valuation done? It's the only pitch lake in the world. It's a wonder of the world. Maybe the valuation would have been 500 million US, or 5,000 million, or 50,000 million. They don't have any more. It's one pitch lake. So who came up with the golden value? So the idea of protecting the public by having a third-party oversight, yes, Uncle Keith is right. I mean, give Jack his jacket. Some things he's right, not always wrong. If you have a procurement regulator, the bureaucracy would slow down the process. Yes, yes. But we all slow down the process in our life by being cautious. That's why we have OSHA. Because you don't want to injure the innocent. So the whole country embraces OSHA to protect life. So we embrace the procurement, everybody. I am telling you that 99% of the PNM embrace the procurement law, because no one loves the corrupt. Everybody understands there's only 1% of the parties stealing. 99% are honest, and they're being driven like sheep over a precipice, following their leaders blindly. And the leaders have a duty. Stuart Young, I admire you. But how could you do this to us? I mean, I know the man sat on Clico, but I mean, God blessed certain members of the PNM who were in cabinet. They own hundreds of millions of assets. God really blessed you, but with that blessing comes a responsibility to share, to care, to ensure, to protect, to give, not to hide and secretly do things. I am embarrassed. At number 1 and number 3 Woodbrook Place. It's just not necessary. It's vulgar. God has already blessed you. What you hoarding? You could compete in the open market without government favors. You should be protected. You should be a saint for the good fortune that our God has given to you. But yet what you're doing, you're passing legislation to weaken the public process. You're litigating against the last Attorney General. And Kamala brought the legislation. Kamala removed the Attorney General and brought legislation to ensure that it does not happen. You come and you're litigating against Anand, tormenting him. But you're coming now and changing legislation so you could do the same? Come on, man. Come on. No, I know I'm going to have a limit of time, but what it boils down to, the presentation is about to begin. What it boils down to is that crime breeds crime. And criminal conduct from our Prime Minister in any form, or an Attorney General not wearing a mask and going and having a big party but want to lock me up if you find me not wearing a mask. Criminal conduct from on top breeds criminal conduct below. If a father is stealing from the wife, the children will steal from each other. It's no rocket science. What I'm about to show and what I want to show, and the genesis of what my presentation today is about, is that there's a trend, there's an underlying trend that's a lot deeper than just this one act of weakening the procurement legislation. There's a trend to lock the people out. There's a trend to secrecy and to a dictatorial approach to governance, that instead of what we expected in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s of a democratizing of our society, we have a dictatorializing of our society, where we are being led down a dirty road by our cabinet and our Attorney General, and I'm going to show you. So, many people aren't aware that in 2019, our central bank wrote several critical things about public-private partnerships and condemned it. And I have the document here. I don't want to read the whole thing. It's 24 lines. But basically what they're saying is that in an analysis, Trinidad and Tobago was ranked 14 out of 19 of the countries in the Caribbean and Latin America in terms of our ability to manage public-private partnerships. And one of the critical weaknesses is staffing and infrastructure, human, intellectual capital infrastructure. We didn't have the people. We didn't have the procedures or the legislation or the systems, and we had a history of corruption. And what they hoped in 2019 was that our illustrious, handsome Prime Minister was going to pass the Procurement Act, the bill, in its original form. It was hoped. And it says that, well, it's a step in the right direction. And it was expected to be proclaimed in August of 2019, and it's a step in the right direction. So, Central Bank 2019 working paper is saying don't do it. And they were hopeful that if you did do it and wanted to go with these public-private partnerships, that the Procurement Act would have been a step in the right direction, not perfect, but better than nothing to protect the public. I didn't say that. That's the central bank. That's the head of the central bank. And so the governor got changed. We have a new head. You come out and you say something and all of a sudden somebody gets sent on early retirement. Is that democracy? So, We have a minister of government that came out and said that, these public-private partnerships, you could save hundreds of millions of dollars. But what they don't say, according to my legal advisor, they don't say what is occurring behind the scenes to sweeten the pot. To sweeten the pot. According to Gabi Hussein, she says the public-private partnerships is a tool of corporate capture. Capture it, take it away. Grab land and infrastructure. And the public are not aware, but the government has a massive agenda for public-private partnership programs. They have the Memorial Plaza development, the Keith Street and South Memorial block, the development of the Salvatore site, the Piccadilly Street development, the Powergen site development, right next door, the City Gate development, the foreshore green space. And for all we know, the foreshore and the port has already been signed off to a Chinese company. We don't know because they've removed it from our purview. There's no one that is protecting the people's interests from politicians who are in cabinet, who are passing laws to give themselves authority. But worse than that, it's a whole trend. The Freedom of Information Act, a year or two ago, they attempted to water it down so that there would be no freedom of information. And right after that, they denied civil society groups access to information of the Environmental Management Authority. They said you can't get EIAs. So if you can't see the EIA, how could you comment? If you can't comment and you don't agree and they do something contrary to the law, how do you know? How do you even challenge? So they're locking everybody out. We fought that one in the High Court and won. And we won the Freedom of Information Act on the ground. But there are other invasions. I'll give you an idea of the most recent invasion. It's happening right now. And what it shows is that there's an ongoing strategy to circumvent the procurement regulator. And it didn't start now. It started with Patrick Manning. Why Patrick Manning? Because we have the Audit Act. And the Audit Act defines the function of the Auditor General. But if Uncle Wade is interested, FFOS would partner all the way to challenge it, because Patrick Manning in the 2002 to 2009 said, wait now, him and his cabinet said, we have this Audit Act that the Auditor General has to review the accounts of the special purpose companies, like the one run by Calder Hart, UNC. And Patrick didn't want that. He said, no. We don't want that. We don't want to audit UNC, nor any of the other VIMCOT and SIMCOT and all the courts. We don't want them to be audited. Why? Give me one reason why. My auditor is my spiritual guru to guide me to see where there's a problem, where there's a weakness, where there's a danger, where there's a leakage. I live by the vocabulary of my auditor. But we had a prime minister didn't want an auditor. Why? The public don't understand. And the professors in university drawing a triple-digit salary, and they're not interested. The corporate sector paying $1 million in tax a year, living in the penthouse, we not affected. Well, something is wrong. Where are our religious leaders, our pundits, our imams? Where are you? Our retirees, our elderly, who's supposed to be guiding our society. This is not against one party or for another party. We came here completely independent. And I admire the parties who have held the event and invited us, knowing that we are totally independent. This is a national issue. So Patrick Manning says, hold on a second. We don't want the Auditor General to check the special purpose companies. And the special purpose companies don't have to comply. They don't have to comply with the Tenders Act. So you have no tendering for what they buy. And we've had governments, quite young when he was there, he tried to put something in place. I think he did put it in place, that any special purpose, any ministry spending more than 500,000 had to have his oversight. They had to know, he had to approve it. You want to spend 500,000? Bring it to me, I have to approve it. Manning came in and said, no, not a shit of that. Why we have to send it to the Minister of Finance? Spend and spend freely. Why? Why? How does it benefit us on the ground? So now the latest in this trend of dictatorial denial, of lack of access, of secrecy, things that promote thievery and corruption, is that they come in with the shipping management bill. And the shipping management bill, we wanted to comment on it, is 600 goddamn pages. 600 pages. And one paragraph contains the bitter evil. And I'm going to read it for you. Section 46 of the bill provides the authority in the performance of its functions is not subject to the provisions of any written law for the procurement of goods and services using public funds, but the authority shall, until such time as it makes its own rules, observe the provisions of that act. So you're making a public authority. Section 46 represents another attempt to weaken the critical procurement regulator's function, because you're taking a new state company, a new special state company, and you're starting them up in Parliament, and you're saying, you know what, you have to follow the procurement regulator, but you're not subject to those provisions until such time that you could make your own rules. So what you're doing, you're creating precedents to make the office of the procurement regulator, which we the people are paying for, into a nonsense office, a shame and disgrace. So it just defies common sense. I'm coming to the end for those of you who've fallen asleep. If the provision recognizes that the authority can function while being monitored by the Office of Procurement Regulator, because it recognizes you're starting off, you could function according to them, but you could make your own rules. Why is it unnecessary to allow them to voluntarily approve itself, to remove itself from the Office of Procurement Regulations? So it's like telling a 4-year-old child, look, I'm giving you $20,000 and I'm going to monitor how you spend it. But at any time you could remove me from monitoring how you spend it. You know human nature. Why are you doing that? You're going to put politically appointed entities to run this new state company, and they have all the authority to establish ports. At a time when China wants to create massive ports, you're creating a special body to manage the giving of ports to people like China, who is government to government, so it's secret. And additional to that, you're letting them sell the people's land because it's ports. This is the entity who will manage the establishment of harbors and ports. So Labre, the Chinese come in for Labre now. So you could sell it to the Chinese government for $1 US and take 10 million US in the Isle of Man under protected shelter. Why? Why create all these structures? Allowing another state entity, another one, after we just went through Calder Heart with the same P&M. You're bringing now, you're creating a situation where you could get many more Calder Hearts. Dr. Rowley could breed them like peas in a pen. It's wrong. I mean, am I sounding disrespectful? I don't mean to, but it's wrong. I want to ask a few questions. How does the author of the shipping bill, the person who deviously drafted this document, How do they sleep at night? Somebody took instructions to write it. And who directed it to put that section 46 in? Is that the Honorable Faris Al-Rawi that in his wisdom thought that that was a good clause? Or did he get an illustrious attorney to advise him on how to create secrecy in this particular state company? Is one of the three or all three? But how you sleep at night? And for you, the listener, who might have fallen asleep already, who I don't know if it will ever get to you in this lifetime, but now that you've heard it, what are you doing about it? And how do you feel if you don't do anything about it? Because for those who say that we're powerless, you obviously have not been into bed with a mosquito. One mosquito can deprive a big full-grown man of a good night's sleep. And we have 1.5 million mosquitoes. It's only a few of them. So we can create change, and we have, and we will. So now my second question. If it is that they are creating this component that these private state companies, these so-called achievement companies that are removed from the red tape, that have no Tenders Act to comply with, that the Auditor General cannot see nothing, he must stay at home. Is this going to apply to all the other special purpose companies? Like a thief in the night, Uncle Faris is going to write an amendment and put a section 46 in for everyone. So Vimcot and Uricot and Vamcot and Bamcot, all of them could do the same. They could do whatever they want, wherever they want, at any price. They could buy and sell the people's assets secretly. Come on, Dr. Rowley, man. I mean, you didn't come from the private sector, but you know enough to know that this is outright thievery. You're creating an environment to promote thievery. And I went on the radio on 95.5, and if you hear thousands of people hate me because I stand up to the PNM, but I'm not against the PNM. I have voted for Auntie Kamala and I have voted for Uncle Keith, and I have both of them on my WhatsApp. Sometimes I tell both of them good night in the same night. I ain't lying. That's the truth. I'm not against anybody, but the Freedom of Information attempt, the access to EIA's attempt, the procurement, what you did with the procurement law is evil. I mean, you know, everybody knows it. Anybody who sees it, here or abroad. And we all want you to do the right thing. Faris, I mean, I'm asking you politely as a gentleman. You must do it. I don't want to demonstrate. Even with COVID, I will demonstrate, you know. I am afraid if you lock me up. But I will not be silenced from exposing what you are doing. So, in the greatest of respect to the listeners and to the members of the party, of both sides, I am calling all the reds and all the yellows and all the greens and oranges, every citizen who feels empowered about protecting our children, protecting our flag. We need a call to action, not just a petition. Not just a petition. Every minute and every person and every conversation, this has to be a central topic. This is the lifeblood of our country. The buying and selling of $50,000 million a year. Plus. That doesn't include all the private special purpose companies. Tiantec and Wassa borrowing privately. So, I recently saw, this is my closing sentence, I recently saw a video on national pride in Jamaica, and it was an inspiring video because I've been to Jamaica many times. I love Jamaica, and I really feel the pride that Jamaicans have for their country. And I feel that pride here for Trinidad, but I don't get the feeling that many of our people feel that pride. Maybe it's the cultural mix, the racial or religious differences, and how we've been driven apart by certain leaders. For whatever reason, many of us don't feel that sense of national pride, that sense of ownership, that this is our place, this is where we are from, this is where we love. And I know many people, many who live outside, who miss Trinidad, who sing extempo calypsos and send them to me about how they miss this land. But for us who are here, we have that special calling to show that love and that pride. Jamaica has 10% of the expenditure per capita compared to Trinidad. And if you see Jamaica, you don't see a vagrant, you don't see a pothole, you don't see a broken pavement. Everything is clean and appears to be orderly on 10% of our expenditure, because there is that sense of pride. So I thank you for the opportunity, Wade, and for you, the audience, for indulging. I hope I wasn't too long, and bless you all. Thank you for all the speakers. Auntie Kamala, thank you especially. Bye.